most of what I'm going to be talking about it should be, should be review. But there may be a few things that are talked about a little bit more detailed than what you've heard about them before. So, to begin with, we need to know what type of life there is on the planet Earth. One type of life that predicates everything else is the prokaryote. Pro means before, karyot means basically chromosome. They do not have a true chromosome. They have DNA, but it's in a little circle, making it very, very easily to replicate. They do not have any organelles. Their DNA or their ribosomes, everything is just in a mishmash inside of their cell membranes, their cell wall. And on the outside could be anything from flagella to cilia to nothing. They may also have a capsule around them, which helps keep them from dying from, say, penicillin or something like that. But again, they're fairly simple, but they've been around forever. If you were to take the one E. coli, which is from your gut, it replicates every 15 minutes. In other words, it evolves through natural selections. They're either selected for or against, and every 15 minutes they replicate. So if I start out with one of them, if they had infinite amount of food and infinite ability to get rid of waste after 48 hours, they would weigh more than the planet Earth. How did we get to us? The idea is called endosymbiosis. It's sort of like if I were a great big fat ugly prokaryote going along, just going very, very slowly. Why? Because I do not use, if I'm anaerobic, I only get 4 ATP out of my glucose. I can't do anything very rapidly. Whereas speeding around towards me is this aerobic bacteria. It gets 36 ATP for the same glucose. Well, neither of us have eyes, and so we run into things. Well, that guy runs into me, and all of a sudden I'm going, oh, wow, everything's great, everything's great. Why? Because he gets inside of me. Through phagocytosis, I pull him inside, and all of a sudden I'm getting huge amount of ATP, my energy source, from each glucose that I have. I'm happier beyond anything I know of. And does he benefit? Yeah, because he's not going to be eaten by something else. That's why it's inside symbiosis, where both of them benefit. Another type of endosymbiosis happened when a photosynthetic prokaryote hit one of these guys. Because now, not only is he making 36 ATP for every glucose, he's making his own glucose. So everything's happy. That's how they think the eukaryotes came around. And the two prokaryotes inside, the mitochondria and the chloroplast, were probably some of the first organelles. Now, the types of organisms that we have on the planet include eukaryotics, besides the prokaryote. The other type is eukaryote, meaning we have a true chromosome. These are the guys that have organelles. Now, we have, some people classify it as 4 kingdoms within eukaryotes. If you are known as an animal, that means you're able to get up, walk around, move on your own. All animals are able to move on their own, and they have to eat food from some other source. They're heterotrophs. There are basically 2 types of animal. One of them is vertebrate. That's what we are, where we have a backbone. And the invertebrate, which means you don't have a backbone. Put it away, please. Then we have plants. All plantae, all organisms in the plant kingdom, are able to use photosynthesis, and they make their own energy, make their own carbohydrates. They photosynthesize. There are 2 types. The type that you have to be planted every year, like dandelions, the seeds have to go out every year and be replanted, or the perennials like the tree where they live for more than one season. Another type are the fungi like old farts like me, where mushrooms are decomposers. You know what a decomposer is, right? It's the thing that undoes Mozart's 15th symphony. It decomposes it. Okay, never mind. I can't help with the way I look. Okay, that's a fungi. Fungi are basically those organisms that decompose. Those would be like the mushrooms and stuff like that. The Protista is an interesting kingdom because typically they're single cell and they have characteristics of the other kingdoms. For example, there are organisms in there that can move, but they also can do photosynthesis at the same time. They have a combination of characteristics, but they're typically single cell. Okay? And those are the Protista. Now, do you know how they got their name? This huge organization of these single cell found out that they were grouped into this mass where they had all these different types of characteristics. And do you know what they did? They protested. Okay, so that's 2 stupid jokes in 5 minutes. Give me a break, okay? So, in a eukaryotic cell, you have the cell membrane and you have the organelles. In particular, you have the organelle, the nucleus, which is surrounded by a membrane. You have membranes inside, such as vacuoles, the mitochondria, the chloroplast. You have membranes like the Golgi apparatus or endoplasmic reticulum. All of those have membranes so that they are compartmentalized. It's like miniature organs inside that cell. Now, we need to be able to name all these things. And when we name them, we start out with King Philip came over from Germany sober. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. If you are in the kingdom animal, that means you're able to move. Any critter in animal is able to move. We are chordata, meaning that we have a backbone. All critters in chordata have a backbone. A worm would not be in chordata. And so forth all the way down. And when we get down here, down to genus and species name, that is done in Latin. Why? Because does Latin change? No, it hasn't been used for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It does not change. And it means the same thing across the globe. Unlike, that critter we have up in the mountains called a mountain lion, that's what we call it here. In Florida, they call it a cougar. We use the name cougar for something else. And we don't want to confuse those two things. Any questions? So, what is evolution? Evolution is a gradual change. Have you evolved since you were younger? Say, you are not the same as what you were 15 years ago. You look completely different. You act completely different. Okay? That is all evolution. You evolve, a species evolves. A species can change. Questions on that? So, how did life originate? Life originated in something called chemical evolution, where if we look at the time, if we start up back here, if we start right here as the origin of our planet Earth, which was 4.6 billion years ago, at that point in time, all we were was a rock. We were a bunch of rocks together, and there was enough gravity, enough mass there, they started crunching each other. And all that force eventually, and the radioactivity that was there, melted the rocks. And when it melted, the heavy stuff went to the center, and all the light stuff went to the outside. And there was enough water from comets to basically allow water to form into something called lakes. Now, if we go in this classroom from the front of the classroom back to the aquarium back there, as 4.6 billion years. If I start up here at the beginning, life would not have started until I'm right underneath the projector. About 3 to 3.5 billion years ago. The first organisms, the first organisms that went onto land, the first plants, would have been the first plants on land. Why were they able to go on land? Because we had enough oxygen up in the sky so that we had started to have an ozone layer. Therefore, there was not as much UV radiation coming down and destroying the DNA. It wasn't until about right here, towards the back of the classroom, that we had plants on land. It wasn't until right here that we had our first mammals on land. It wasn't until right here that we had Australopithecus, the first ancestor that had hips that were upright, meaning it walked upright. And it came the width of my pinky away from today, of this entire room, distance in the room. The Homo sapiens first came on land. If I pull out a hair, the distance of my hair from this tape is the distance that Homo sapiens started from today. And when you were born, from today to this line is the width of an HIV virus molecule. Not very big compared to this length. So your time on Earth has not been big. If we look, there has been a huge amount of time where there's very little, if any, life. But during that time, the chemicals were coming about so life could come about. The idea was that we had some chemicals in our atmosphere. Ammonia, CO2, a little bit of sulfur dioxide, methane, hydrogen, no oxygen. Oxygen didn't come around for a huge amount of time until we started getting oxygen on the planet Earth, and until we got plants on the planet Earth. And so these were all there. But during that time, there was lots and lots of heat, lots and lots of energy. There was no ozone, so there was a lot of UV radiation, a lot of energy all over the place. And they started bombarding. And when they did, eventually the hypothesis was that there was eventually biological molecules. Well, there was a couple people that got the Nobel Prize for this idea. And their idea, they experimented with it. What they did is they took some glass tubing, they made it into something that looked like this. And in this glass tubing, they completely and totally sterilized it. They put some water in it. They put some gases, the methane, ammonia, water, and hydrogen. And then they put 2 leads that would be able to spark. And so then at the lower left-hand corner, they boiled the water. It went up and came down through the cloud of all those gases as the lightning was happening. They just let it go. After 4 days, the clear water turned brown. The reason it turned brown is it started developing amino acids. It started developing fatty acids. Biological molecules were developing after 4 days. Well, if this was happening in the ancient atmosphere, there would be places like the ocean. Who cares? They're so far away. But there would be places like ponds where it might start concentrating. And someday, magically, it might get into something we call a micelle. This micelle is this thing right here where it's like a piece of soap, where part of the soap likes water, part of the soap likes fat. And if it's organized right, you'll have a lipid bilayer where the inside will be completely separated, the water inside will be completely separated from the water outside. Now, I know this sounds almost impossible for it to happen, but let me ask you this question. Have any of you played the lottery? I played once. I spent like $5, and did I win? Heck no, I have 1 in 200 million chance of win. However, if I played once a week, would I increase my chance of winning? If I played every day, if I could play every day and chance winning how about if I played every nanosecond of every day for 1 billion years? Could I win? If every nanosecond of every year for 1 billion years, these molecules were mixing, could they form life? Yeah. So the timeline of, okay, I was supposed to do that. Okay, biological evolution. Any questions about the origin of life? Once we had life, natural selection, evolution started to happen. What is evolution? It's simple change. Evolution is not a ladder. It's not a stepping stone to humans. We are not as evolved as E. coli. But our evolution, where we are, is more like a bush, where each bush, on this bush, we have our ancestors. Right at the top of that blue line are my grandparents. Over here are my mom and dad. Over here would be my uncle and aunt. This would be me. This would be my brother. Over here, not so closely related, would be my cousin, Joe. This would be my cousin Alicia and her kids. Where if you're farther away on this bush, you're going to have less and less in common. But we have a common ancestor. We have someone back in the back where our genetics is based on them. That's how we got our genetics. Now, one of the sad things about this bush idea is so many of the critters behind us are gone. Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Australopithecus, our ancestors are gone. But who we are is based, because of this bush, on them. There are still critters alive, branching up from them. There are some sequences, like the dinosaurs, which are gone. Completely and totally gone because of events that happened 60 million years ago. And therefore, they have stopped in the back. There was a guy back 150 years ago that he had just graduated from high school, basically the high school, and he was starting college. And he was not very good at it. He loved plants, he loved animals, especially birds. He was phenomenal at that, but he was not very good at college. And his uncle, extremely rich man, said, Chuck, you got to get hold of things. You're starting to date my brother, my daughter, your cousin, and I'm sending you away for a couple of years. Date his cousin, his uncle's daughter. And so he's sending him away for a couple of years. So for a couple of years, he went on a ship. And the ship went around the world. And he was great at this because he loved birds. He was very methodical. And they went down the east coast of South America, up the west coast, and they came to an island called the Galapagos. In the Galapagos, Darwin noticed a type of bird. All the birds basically looked alike, except for their beaks. And he hypothesized that this bird ancestors were blown over to Galapagos from South America during a storm. And those ones that were over Galapagos were able to land and survive. The ones that were 10 miles away croaked. And what he noticed is that there were differences in the beaks. Why? Because when they first got there was just two birds. And they had plenty of food. But they had kids, and more kids, and more kids. And suddenly there was not as much food. But fortunately, Philip, one of their kids, had too big of a beak. And therefore, instead of chewing on seeds, he started chewing on nuts. And this guy over here, Susan, his daughter, the daughter of the Finches, they had a real narrow beak. And what they were able to do is start eating insects that were inside of the tree. And they started, and then all the ones with the narrow beaks got together and formed families. The one over here with the bigger beak was able to form families and so forth. And so they radiated out from the original one. They started out as one species, but eventually other species came about. They filled different niches. A niche, N-I-C-H-E-S, is not just where they live, but it's what they do, what they eat, how they look, stuff like that. Are there questions on that? And again, here they radiated out from one, and now there's basically 3 different families of the finches, groups of finches. So what did he say? How did this happen? When organisms reproduce, they oftentimes have more kids that can survive. For example, in Mr. Haney's classroom right now, he has too many mice. He has a cage with lots of mice. One of the moms had babies. Well, mice have a population control method where if there's too many babies, rather than letting them live and suffer because there's not enough food or allow the whole community to collapse, they will eat the babies, and that's what they did. So some of the offspring will survive, some of them will not survive. And because that there's competition, if there is a competition and certain ones are selected against, they don't survive. So there's competition for food, for mates, for where you live, and getting away from predators. If you're not able to fly, you're not going to get away from a kitty cat. So this one right here is an example of the survival of the fittest. This is called the pepper moth. This was investigated about the time of Charles. What happens is on here, you can see the 2 moths right there. Fairly easy. Back in Charles' day, this is what the trees looked like. However, the trees were starting to look like this. Can you notice in the one on the right, can you see the black moth? It's harder to see. Which one of those 2 would a bird probably eat? The one they can see, the white one. On the one, as originally, the white one you can't see. Back when the trees were not covered with soot, with junk. And so the black one would have eaten. And due to changing circumstances, those that can fit into the change will survive. Those that cannot do not survive. So again, here, all these critters radiated out. Radiation goes in all directions. All these different birds go in different directions so they can fill different niches. And they fill these niches because they were open habitats. Why is that important, open habitats? Because if there's no open habitat, you won't survive. For example, 65 million years ago, were we up and around? No. Were our ancestors up and around? Yeah. We had an ancestor at that point in time called a shrew. Shrew is about 1 inch to 2 inches long. And it was not doing much. Why? Because if it had gotten bigger, it would have been noticed by the velociraptors or the T-Rex and been lunch instead of alive. But because something selected against the dinosaurs, the shrew was able to adapt and radiate from that little pre-mouse to all of us. So eventually, when this is happening, a species will be born. That's called speciations. A species can go from one species into multiple species, and it's a two-step process. The first one is called geographic isolation, where they're separated from each other. Second is called reproductive isolation, because they're separated, they cannot have kids. Best example that's easy to understand is a bunch of ground squirrels, antelope squirrels, that lived in what is now the Grand Canyon. It was flat at one point in time. And so they had a good old time playing with each other. But one day, Fred was separated from George by a stream, and they couldn't get across. And that stream kept on going deeper and deeper and deeper. And the two of them are completely different now. Why? Because how many of you have been to the Grand Canyon? Have you been to the South Rim? It's really hot. The North Rim, however, is really cool. It's got pine trees, all kinds of great stuff, and therefore the two of them would have had to adapt to different situations because they're different. And because of because of their separation, they cannot have sex over long distances. Doesn't work across the Grand Canyon. Another way that reproductive isolation doesn't work is where, how do I put this delicately? The parts do not work together anymore. Do I need to explain it in any more detail? Okay. Now, in this whole thing, there's a guy by the name of Stephen Jay Gould, who lots of people like to read his stuff because he's very good at writing, very well, but he became famous enough that he was part of a Simpsons cartoon, which is kind of cool. And so his idea is unlike Darwin's. Darwin is the one on the left where it's called a gradual, where there's going to be a gradual change through time of every single species. Gould said, no, let's look at the fossils. They disagree. He said, oh, there was not a gradual change through humans until there was a niche open. The dinosaurs died, and therefore the niche that they filled became empty. Once it became empty, we could fill it. We could start, we had all the mutations ready to go, but until there's someplace for you to live, it doesn't matter. You cannot fill that niche. So speciation is going from one critter to two, oftentimes with very drastic changes in what you look like and so forth. And ways that it happens, first way is by a mutation, where we change the DNA. If we change your genetics, we change the way you act, the way you look, and so forth. Sometimes when there is a mutation within a group, one of them may be selected for, where it is an adaptation that is beneficial. If it's a beneficial one, you'll stay around. Even though you're one in a crowd of 1,000, if it's beneficial, the genetics of the group might start drifting because of that one difference. And that's called a genetic drift, where it starts out isolated and it drifts along. Another one, this would be within there, we might have a change because of some isolation like a river or a Grand Canyon happening. Another thing that could happen is something called the founder effect, where we have immigration to a new location, and therefore a change. My wife bought me a DNA kit where I found out my ancestors, and by looking at me, you would think I'm mostly from Europe. However, I have somewhere between around 5% Asian blood. And what I know from my ancestors who did research is that one of my ancestors actually married a Native American. And they had kids, and I'm one of the descendants of that kid. Why? How can I become Asian from Native America? Well, the Asians are the founders of the Americas. During a ice age, there was a land bridge between Asia, Siberia, and North America. And when that happened, the Asians came across, and they were the founders of the Americas. They were the founders, the people that were first came into the region, the first humans into the Americas. Just like that finch had the founder effect in the Galapagos. It was the first one there, and it spread out. All the others descended from it. Another thing that is very much a case in evolutionary change is natural selection, where there is differential reproduction based on your population. For example, certain populations, like if you go, okay, how do I say this delicately? I love Samoans. They have some of the greatest personality in the world. However, they tend to be very large individuals. Why? Because it was the people that had wealth had lots of food, and therefore they grew to have genetics that were similar. In China, for whatever reason, it became women that had long fingernails were desirable. My daughter has fingernails that grow, they're very, very long, very, very thick. They don't break. If I tried to grow my fingernails that long, they would self-destroy very rapidly. So that's natural selection, where there are reproduction of individuals is not just on the genetics, but oftentimes on preferences. These four things act together to give us who and what we are and what all the organisms are. Now, if we look at this, when we have natural selection, we can do one of three things. If we look at this population here, it's a curve where there are a few organisms that are small, a few organisms that are large, but the vast majority are halfway in between. Well, if we have evolution called stabilizing evolution, that is where the large ones and the small ones are selected against. They somehow are killed. And therefore, all the rest of them are going to be halfway in between. There could also be a selection against all the short ones, or against all the tall ones, where they're one extreme. Or a very uncommon one, where you've got the diversifying succession, where everyone in the middle is killed off. Now, one of the ones where this one is the case is with bacteria. If you don't use your antibiotic properly, you're supposed to use it for 10 days, but you only use it one day, it kills off the weak bacteria, making the rest of them, the ones that survived, are stronger. And therefore, the next generation is going to be able to withstand higher and higher doses of antibiotics. Are there questions on that? So, some of the evidence for this evolution is biogeography. Do I need to go into any more about that? Basically, if we look at this, if you have the mainland right here and you have a large island and a small island, equal distance away from the mainland, which one's going to get more birds or whatever on it? The big one or the small one? Big one, because it's larger. There's more places for it to land. If we look at this small one, okay, so we have A and B, more going to be on A than B. If we look at A, B, or C, where A and C are the equal size, which one's going to have more critters, A or C? Which one's going to have more critters, B or C? Probably B. Okay, because this is bigger, it might have more going to it. But because this is smaller, and so because it's closer, it might have more to it. Fossils are another evidence of evolution. If, for example, I got really, I'm not going to do this, but if Chris said something really, really nasty to me, and I broke his neck accidentally, and I drug him out to the middle of Hahamunga, and he died, And about 5 years later, Arthur said really something nasty to me. And I broke his neck, and I drug him out to Hahamunga. What? And about 5 years later, Richard said something or came in really, really late to class, and I broke his neck and pulled him out. And during that time, wouldn't there be soil piling up on them?
Whoa.
Couldn't you tell, based on how deep they were, which one died first? That's one of the things with fossil records. You can do relative dating. No, that's not with your cousin. That's basically how long ago one died based on how deep it was. So the ones that are deep, farther down are from farther apart. There's another way of dating it, and that's called a radioactive date. That is not a hot date, it's radioactive dating. And the way I can explain that is with carbon-12 and carbon-14. With carbon-12, when I'm breathing, say I pull in equal amounts of carbon-12 and carbon-14 into my body. And when I'm breathing, walking around, I have equal amounts. But when I die, because Richard broke my neck, after 5,000 years, the amount of carbon-12 in my body will be the same. However, I will no longer have 100 grams of carbon-14. I will have 50 grams. And after another 5,000 years, I will have 25 grams. But I will still have the 100 grams of carbon-12. By looking at the ratio between carbon-12 and carbon-14, you can approximate how long ago they died. Another thing that is looking at evolution that verifies it is taxonomy. How close are we to all of our relatives? If we look at these guys over here, all the animals, we are very, very closely related to frogs, to other chordates. Are we as closely related to starfish? No, because they have different body parts. And we're farther apart, obviously, from the fungi and from other vascular plants. There's also something called homologous structures. Homologous structures mean the turtle, alligator, bird, mammal, and fish are all closely related because we have structures that have the same bones in them. They all have fingers and thumbs and stuff like that. However, they're homologous because they have the same bone. However, they have different functions. That's a homologous structure. One of the best, I don't know if you can read this, comparative embryology. If we look at this, all these guys through here are embryos. If you notice, are human embryos very different than a fish embryo? No. Why? Because the developmental genes for all of us are essentially the same. If you look at us when we're in utero, when you were about 5 days after fertilization, you had gills. We had a tail. Until about 3 or 4 weeks, we had a tail. We then changed because we are essentially the same because we have relatives in these other groups. They may be farther apart than we are, but they are relatives to us. Another one is looking at the DNA. If we look at our DNA and proteins, we share 90, if we look back to orangutans, we are sharing a huge amount of DNA. We can, if we look back at Neanderthal, get some, or a Homo erectus, we share some of their DNA. And if we look at our similarity between humans, chimps, and I believe it's Bonino, we are within 1.2% identical. 98.8% of our DNA is identical. Between us and gorillas, 97.4% identical DNA. So we are family members. Any questions?